While some are hailing the election of Hassan Rowhani in Iran as the victory of moderation over extremism, others are warning not to be too optimistic. Is Mr. Rohani capable of bringing change? We'll find out next on The Line. This is On the Line, and I'm Aisha Tanzeen. In his first press conference as the president-elect this week, Hassan Rowhani talked about moderation, constructive interaction with the world, and transparency in Iran's nuclear program. But some analysts are warning not to be deceived by the words and keep in mind the man's past performance. Earlier, I talked to Setareh Derakhshesh, the deputy director of VOA's Persian News Network, and Sohrab Ahmari, the assistant books editor at the Wall Street Journal. Setareh, starting with you, the 2009 elections in Iran were highly disputed. This time, Mr. Rohani has won over 50% of the registered voters. Do you think these elections are more legitimate?
Well, I think there are two schools of thoughts. One of them is that this was orchestrated and choreographed by the regime to replace the loose talker and confrontational Ahmadinejad with a president that at least would be perceived as somewhat more moderate. And there is another school of thought saying that at the very last minute, maybe the Iranian people thought that they could vote for someone who possibly could get them out of these disastrous economic situation they're in. So these are the two different views that exist. Whether it's legitimate or not, I'm not inside Iran, and we go by the numbers that are given to us. But what we know that in 2009, people came out in the streets and they were asking the establishment where their vote was. This time the regime is telling us that Mr. Rohani has got 51% of the vote, so I would assume this is more acceptable to the Iranian people, and we go by what we see.
Okay, Sohrab, I want you to add to that and also talk about economy. Mr. Rohani talked a lot about how economy is at the top of his agenda. Does he have a solid plan?
Let's start with the structure. You had 600 candidates who vied for the presidency, and out of those, 8 men were selected. Here are the groups that were automatically out. Iranian women weren't even allowed to compete. If you were a Persian Jew or Iranian Jew, you were not allowed to compete. If you were Christian, you were not allowed to compete, nor even if you were a Sunni Muslim. So out of the group that was there, you already had a whole bunch of people discriminated against on the basis of gender and ethnic or religious affiliation. And then out of the rest that survived, there were more cuts of people who were not seen as sufficiently loyal to the regime, including a former president, Rafsanjani. So that's the structure that you're working with. It's still a theocratic dictatorship, even if there is this sort of sham electoral process. Now, we do know turnout was high. 70% of the people voted, according to those numbers, but you have to take that with a large chunk of salt, because in Iran, a lot of folks, a lot of sectors of society are required to vote. If you want to maintain your state benefits or you want to move ahead in your job, you have to vote.
Okay, now I understand that there's some problems with the structure. Iran's not the only country with these structural problems. But Setareh, what I want to ask you is it looked upon by analysts as at least a step in the right direction that people voted out of the 6 candidates for the most moderate candidate in their eyes?
Well, I think the structure is important. As you said, this is not the only country that has this type of problems. But I think the West is now choosing to go with the more positive outlook and perspective. And I just want to quote the president. President Obama had an interview with Charlie Rose, and he said that the environment and the atmosphere is much more positive, and we can engage in a more serious talk with Iranians. So I believe that the West would like to think that the Iranians' approach is changing. Now, I don't know about the structure and the system, but obviously, when also in the press conference that Mr. Rohani had, it was quite interesting and very impressive. Iranian journalists were asking him really legitimate questions about unemployment and so forth, and your question was about the economy. I'd like to make a comment on that in a little bit. But they asked him, when are we going to change? And he said, change has already started and everything is positive. And you know also his outlook his negotiations or the way he's going to negotiate with the West are going to be more positive. So I think this is what the West would like to see, that there is a new approach and it's going to be more positive in a more positive atmosphere and environment.
So let's move on to economy. Sohrab, do you think he has a solid economic agenda, or at least a good team that can enforce that agenda?
If you want to fix Iran's economy, you have two major problems as I see it. The first are the sanctions that are imposed by the West and the mounting sanctions regime, which is getting increasingly tight, and the economic noose is really tightening around the Iranian people's necks, and it is bearing down on average people. So that's one problem you have to fix. The other problem that you have to fix is the corruption. You had a sort of quasi-privatization in Iran beginning in the 1990s, late 80s actually, through to right now. But the sort of privatization that happened wasn't genuine market mechanisms, assets priced the way they should be, and so on and so forth. You had cronyism and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is still the most powerful social force in that society, taking over large chunks of the economy. So let's say you're Rohani and you're actually going out in good faith to try to fix the Iranian economy. You want to first try to handle the sanctions, make sure that there's actually...
During his campaign, he did criticize his opponents for being too uncompromising with the West and getting too many crippling sanctions on Iran. Do you think he'll be more compromising?
Well, let me, and that's where I was going to go, is let's assume that he wants to be more compromising. I actually don't concede that. I'm just saying, for example, let's pretend like he is. Well, he'll run up against the supreme leader, who's consistently held a hard line on the nuclear program and also the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. These are groups that are invested both ideologically and in terms of their own political interests in maintaining that program. So when he goes up against them, just like in the 1990s, the minuscule reform attempts of Khatami were blocked by the IRGC and the hardline supreme leader, you're going to have the same thing. And if you want to tackle the corruption and the IRGC cronyism over the Iranian economy, well, again, you've gone up against the most powerful force in that society now.
In Iran. We'll come to it, but Setareh, what I want to ask you is, Mr. Rohani is also considered very close to the Ayatollah. So could it be that the moderation and the change he's talking about starting could have the blessing of the Ayatollah?
Well, if I may go back, I will respond to that in a minute. I want to go back to your question on the economy. I think for every economy to flourish, you need a free society. These are intertwined. Whether there is corruption or not, whether the IRGC is extremely...
Although I'll give you the example, China is not considered a free country otherwise, but the economy is flourishing.
That is true, and there are some similarities between that society. You're absolutely right. But in general, generalizing, you do need political freedom in order for people to flourish, for the economy to develop. Unfortunately, we do not have, or we do not see such freedom in Iran, aside from the problem of corruption and the power of authority of the IRGC. That is the number one rule and element, and it's much needed inside Iran. On the economic agenda of Mr. Rohani, unlike the other candidates, they were dealing with issues such as inflation, such as unemployment. He was questioning the institutions, the economic institutions. And what he mentioned about his plan was that he will do some planning and he will take care of everything with hope. I'm not sure if a country that has a disastrous economic situation could be handled, could be taken care of with hope and planning. We do not have a clear planning of Mr. Rohani. Now, going back to your second question, whether this is a positive sign, whether there must be something from the blessing of the Ayatollah, of the Grand Ayatollah. There is a theory also that says that some people say that this, again, was orchestrated, and he did not only have the blessing of Ayatollah Khamenei, but also there was a deal that was made between Ayatollah Khamenei and Rafsanjani. This is what we hear from inside Iran, that Rafsanjani would be disqualified, he would step aside, and then they would push somewhat reformist, and that's, we shouldn't use it in loose terms, but somewhat moderate candidate that would be Mr. Rohani, that would replace Rafsanjani. So there will be a balance of power also.
Okay, so you guys both seem to think that this might be, that he will not push for reform. But Sohrab, what I want to ask you is that isn't it possible that because of the crippling sanctions that there is some thinking inside the Iranian regime itself that we need to bring it back more to the center? They've gone very right-wing in the last 8 years.
I don't believe so. I think that the ruling establishment on the whole realizes that the nuclear program, and the closer they get to the bomb, it's the way to ensure their survival in a society that otherwise they will have a lot of trouble controlling. And you can look at Rouhani's history. I heard the word moderate thrown around, and I think it's a really bad term. It really is not giving the Iranian people a lot of credit if you say that this guy is a moderate when, and I'm going to just go into the domestic front for 2 seconds. This is a guy who, when the 1999 student uprising happened, he said, we need to crush the students, I quote, mercilessly and monumentally. And in fact, they did, and I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal on Monday describing what happened in the aftermath of Mr. Rouhani's speech. So I don't think people change. I don't think politicians fundamentally in their worldview change. Now, on the nuclear front, again, I mean, Rouhani is a guy who has said, who has boasted that during the period in which he was the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, he's repeatedly boasted that we actually went ahead, went further. What you'll see with Rohani is someone who isn't nearly as much of a crazy rhetorician. He's not going to go out and convene Holocaust denial conferences. This is not a guy who's going to maybe say something like the state of Israel needs to be...
Isn't he also, Sohrab, the guy who convinced the Ayatollah to end the clandestine military nuclear program in 2003? Isn't he close enough to the Ayatollah that he can bring some of those factors into the decision-making?
Yeah, if you read Sayyid Hossein Mousavian's memoir, Sayyid Hossein Mousavian, who's now at Princeton, was Rouhani's spokesman at the time. And what he said is that what we were doing is basically hoodwinking the West with better rhetoric. And they criticized Ahmadinejad not for making genuine substantive movements toward complying with Iran's international requirements under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What they say is, we were just better. We were able to fudge the definition of suspension of enrichment rather than a binding legal commitment to make it a confidence-building measure, meaning we only need to do it for a period of time, and then we can go do it further on down the road, which is precisely what they've done. Okay. So I just don't think there's a clash of views between him and Mr. Khamenei.
That was my discussion with Setareh Derakhshesh of VOA's Persian News Network and Sohrab Ahmari of Wall Street Journal. When we come back, we'll talk to Trita Parsi of the National Iranian-American Council. Stay with us.
Voice of America. 1,500 hours of news and information.
Educational and cultural programming to more than 134 million people
worldwide each week.
Listen to us on radio.
Watch us on television.
Follow us on Facebook or Twitter.
And through your mobile device.
VOA.
We're dynamic
and consistent
in bringing you
the most reliable information in 43 languages.
Tune in.
Tune in.
Welcome back to On the Line. I'm Aisha Tanzeen. We're talking about Iran's newly elected president, Hassan Rouhani, and whether he can bring change to the country's domestic and foreign policies. Joining me in the studios is Trita Parsi, the president of the National Iranian-American Council and author of A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. Mr. Parsi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, one of our former guests suggested that Mr. Rouhani is no moderate. Is he?
Well, it depends on what context that you're talking about it. Some people want to see an instant transition from the current system that they have in Iran, which is not democratic and is quite repressive, into some sort of a liberal, Western, perhaps Swedish democracy. Nowhere has that taken place successfully. So he is a moderate in the context of Iranian politics. He's not a reformist, and I think that's important to understand. He belongs to the centrist factions within Iranian politics. But if one approaches this from the perspective that they have to be a complete reflection of what the U.S. wants them to be, then we're always going to be disappointed, because there's rarely going to be anyone coming out of this system, at least, that will be sufficiently acceptable. The question, though, is, can he make changes that are meaningful to Iran's domestic policy and foreign policy?
And can he, given that the ultimate authority still lies with the Ayatollah?
Well, I think the ultimate authority does lie with Supreme Leader. However, there has been an assumption on the Western side that essentially says that the supreme leader is all-powerful. And I think this election was a clear wake-up call that shows that no, not at all. He is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful person in Iran, but he's not all-powerful. Because the outcome of this election is clearly not what he wanted. In fact, the conservatives did quite a lot to try to stack the cards in such a way so that a centrist or a moderate would not be able to win, yet he won.
Although Mr. Rafsanjani, who was considered more of a moderate, was not even allowed to compete, as were 600 other candidates that were not allowed to compete.
This is a tremendously unfair election. There is nothing fair about the way that the Guardian Council is excluding candidates. But put yourself in the shoes of not people in Washington, but people in Iran. And you have very few opportunities to, through peaceful means, try to get some sort of a change. And elections used to be one of them. In the last election, when there was massive fraud and the regime acted so violently, a lot of people lost faith that that path no longer is available. This election was a big test. What it really showed is the chances of peaceful change from within 10%, or is it 0.10%? And I think it showed that it's closer to 10%, still not at all as good as it should be, but quite a lot better to be in a situation in which people would feel like there's no chance of peaceful change, the population would get radicalized and potentially end up in a Syria scenario.
Now, do you think the West at this point and the rest of the world should engage with this new administration? And on what grounds?
The U.S. is already engaged. The question of whether to engage or not engage is a debate of the past. There is a P5+1 process. There is engagement. It is not particularly successful engagement, and in my view, not particularly successfully constructed engagement. But engagement is there, and that's not going to change. In fact, it would be very odd if the Iranian people, 18 million of them, voted for the moderation that they could get, that was on the ballot, and the response of the West would be that we would withdraw and not engage and actually go for more confrontational policies. So there will be engagement. The question, though, that I think is relevant to Washington is, are we going to miss this opportunity that perhaps exists in Iran by being too cynical, being too skeptical, or will we actually even dismiss the opportunity by assuming that there is no opportunity to begin with?
Now, I understand that there needs to be engagement. However, we hear from people like Mr. Said Mousavi, who used to be a spokesperson of Mr. Rohani, who writes in his own memoirs that when they were handling the nuclear issue, they were quote-unquote hoodwinking the West and the rest of the world while they were promoting their nuclear program. On one hand, they were using rhetoric and the kind of diplomatic language that would buy them more time. So how do you trust somebody who's done something like this in the past?
Well, it's interesting that you pointed that out, because the French ambassador to Iran at that time is crediting Rohani, for instance, for being the person who convinced Supreme Leader Khamenei to suspend enrichment, but also to end the military dimensions of the work that Iran was doing pre-2003. The world is not black and white. It's in many nuances. Those who say that they are in black and white are the same people that got the United States involved in the invasion of Iraq that has been the biggest strategic mistake that the U.S. has committed in this century. There are nuances to things. There are plenty of reasons and missed opportunities on both sides. Everyone can say that the other side is not trustworthy, and there is no doubt that there is a huge deficit of trust right now. The question is, if you decide not to engage, if we withdraw from this idea, or if we're so skeptical that we think that nothing can be done, what are the options that you're left with? The only options you're left with is essentially military confrontation. Those who dismiss the potential opportunity, and I want to emphasize potential opportunity, should be more honest and come forward and say that what they actually want is war.
Now, what would both sides have to do, both Iran and the West, to make sure that when they come to the table this time, it's more meaningful than it has been in the past?
I think that's a great question. It has not been fully meaningful in the past. Both sides need to be far more flexible than they have been in the past. Both sides are afraid of taking risks for compromise and peace, but don't seem to have the same fear of taking risks for confrontation and escalation. There is an asymmetric situation in which risks for peace, for some reason, are viewed as far more dangerous than risks for escalation. They need to do that. They need to come to the table much more seriously. There needs to be greater flexibility, but there also needs to be far greater commitment from both sides to the idea that we have to pursue diplomacy to make it succeed. Even in this town, those who favor diplomacy are very quick to also put forward a plan B of what we do when it will fail.
But again, that brings us back to the trust deficit. You can be diplomatic with someone that you believe is being diplomatic back. But how can you be diplomatic with someone without a plan B when you feel the other person is hoodwinking you?
No one is saying that you shouldn't have a plan B, but the way this is going forward oftentimes is that the plan B is the real plan A, meaning that you just pursue the plan A for 2 weeks and then you declare it dead and then you quickly go back to what is safe, which is a confrontational policy. This is very common on the Iranian side as well. There is a fear of reaching out. There is a fear. In fact, I would say the United States is right now exactly where Iran was 4 years ago, because then there was a new president smiling, talking about a new foreign policy. His election was the rejection of the foreign policy of the previous president. That president's name was Barack Obama. What did the Iranians do? They could not bring themselves to believe that Obama could be any different. And they acted on that assumption, and they got the predictable result. They were not creative, courageous enough to realize that there is an opportunity, and as a result, they missed and dismissed the opportunity. Now the U.S. is faced with the same option. It can commit the same mistake, or it can show itself to be more open-minded, more courageous, and more creative than the Iranians were 4 years ago.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time, but our time is up. I really want to thank Trita Parsi, the president of the National Iranian-American Council. And I want to thank you for joining us. Please send us your questions or comments or watch our past shows on our website, voanews.com/ontheline. We look forward to hearing from you and hope you'll join us again next week for another episode of On the Line.
North Carolina buys 5.6 billion gallons of liquid fuels annually, and the goal of the state's strategic plan for biofuels leadership is that by the year 2017, 10% of liquid fuels, about 600 million gallons of fuel, will come from biofuels locally grown and produced. To reach this goal, North Carolina's General Assembly created the Biofuel Center to develop a state biofuels industry and reduce this dependence. The center is the nation's first agency to address comprehensively all aspects of long-term biofuel development within a state. Stephen Burke is its president.
Our approach is to look at the very landscape of North Carolina, our fields, our farms, our roads, the persons who drive vehicles on those roads, our universities, our policymakers, and say to each of them, changes are going to come about in the next years.
As a renewable, clean-burning fuel that also lowers tailpipe emissions, biodiesel is produced from a variety of feedstocks, such as soybeans, waste vegetable oil, animal fats, and recycled cooking fats. But in this field, scientists are revealing the potential of forestry feedstocks as an energy source.
Realistically, in a state rich in forest resources, with 18 million acres of forested land, we anticipate that trees, forest materials, cellulosic biomass will be our greatest resource. Fortunately, our forest resources are so great in amount that we can add biofuels to our resources as a whole new sector. Probably realistic first pass estimate is that within 15 years, 2/3 of our biomass in this state will come from forest and cellulosic materials.
North Carolina poplar trees show great potential as a source for biofuels. The tree grows 12 feet a year, matures in less than 4 years, and can reach a total height of up to 100 feet. Poplar trees' fast growth means that it could be a steady source of biomass in managed forests. Yellow poplar is most abundant and reaches its largest size in North Carolina's mountains.
Biofuels, new around the world, is only now being seen in North Carolina, and I hope elsewhere, as so extraordinarily important a topic and indeed an endeavor. It is our learning so far that North Carolina is unique in trying to put all of these pieces in a cohesive framework. In North Carolina, we are fortunate. Our growing conditions enable us to grow throughout our state a very wide range of biomass sources, some appropriate to yield biodiesel, some appropriate to yield bioethanol. And the list is perhaps greater in this state than is true in other places. Grasses, industrial sweet potatoes, canola, soybeans, in time algae, and trees and cellulosic biomass sources.
Yearly, North Carolina will need 228,500 acres of purpose-grown, fast-growth trees to reach its goal of 600 million gallons of homegrown biofuels per year.
I'm VOA reporter Roseanne Skirbel. Here on the campus of the University of Maryland, students have their eyes on a prestigious aeronautical prize. Their challenge is to build and fly a human-powered helicopter. Check it out. Gamera 2 is proving itself. What seemed impossible when project manager William Stark began his PhD studies at the University of Maryland 3 years ago is now within reach.
It's flown for 60 seconds and on a different flight has gone to an altitude of 9 feet. Those are 2 of the 3 goals required to win the Sikorsky Prize. We're hoping now to combine both of those into a single flight, get that little bit of extra altitude we need, and keep the helicopter controlled and stable.
50 volunteers make up the team developing the flyer. Their machine is built from composite microcarbon materials, balsa, foam, and other lightweight materials. Unlike a normal helicopter, the rotor blades are positioned under the craft and operate close to the ground.
By keeping our blades low, they actually take less power to run. As we climb, it gets harder and harder for the pilot.
The perfect test pilot is thin and strong, like graduate student Colin Gore.
I've got a lot of muscle compared to the rest of my body.
When the pilot cranks with his hands and feet, he begins to reel in a string that runs through the craft and is attached to the rotors. As they begin to spin, the flyer takes off.
We're looking for controlled flight. Part of the criteria for the Sikorsky Prize so that we don't drift. 30 seconds.
On flight test days, PhD student Elizabeth Weiner helps direct the pilot and support team. And left disappointed with Gamera 2's performance just a few weeks ago. On this day, she's joined William Stark at a campus warehouse to inspect the damage.
I found one that popped.
Despite recent setbacks, Stark and Weiner agree that the project has been deeply satisfying.
We've gotten the opportunity to go through an actual design and flight test experience, and that's the sort of thing you never get to do. And it's a lot of fun going out there and building something and flying it and trying to do the impossible.
For me, it's knowing that we did it, and we did it first.
And they're doing it after being challenged to enter the competition 4 years ago by aerospace professor Inderjeet Chopra. He's proud of what they've accomplished and what they're about to do.
It will be an enormous joy when we complete it.
Pilot Colin Gore is ready.
I feel like I've got like a high profile, but probably easiest job out of all of them. Just because I've just got to dump some power into it and give them the performance that they deserve.
The Gamera 2 team plans to make another attempt at the Sikorsky Prize for a